Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here today and to be invited to chair what has now turned into the final panel of the day that is actually covering a range of subjects. My name is Gareth Stansfield. I'm a professor of Middle East politics at the University of Exeter in the UK, and I have worked quite extensively on Iraq's politics and economics in the past, and it is great for me to be able to interview our panelists today who will be covering a range of subjects, including renewable energy, financial frameworks and legal frameworks of Iraq. We may also hit on some other areas as well, depending on how the discussion goes. Today we've got 5 speakers. We have His Excellency Nafi Abdul Sadr, who is the Deputy Minister of Electricity and Transmission. We then have Martin Sobek from the International Finance Corporation. We then have Zainab Al-Qurnawi from the QC law firm, and then Robin Mills, the CEO of Qamar Energy, and then finally, last but certainly not least, Hussein Zubaydi from Capital Investments. Some of our presenters have presentations to make, others will be speaking from the floor. I will ask them to present, and then we will open up for discussion into the rest of the afternoon. Minister. Okay, thank you.
سيدات والسادة الحضور، مساء الخير جميعا. لنا الشرف أن نكون ضمن الحضور megawatt in this summer, and the transmission network capacity in 400 kV around 30,000 MVA, with the number of substation 400 kV 41 substation 400 kV and 247 substation 132 kV, with the total capacity 38,000 MVA. And number of mobile substation 132 is 270 substation. The lines, we have 65 transmission lines 400 kV and with length more than 5,000 kilometers, and transmission lines 132 kV is more than 548 lines, with a total length is 13,087 kilometers. And the capacity of distribution network, we have more than 743 per minute substation 33 to 11 kV, and we have more than 114 mobile substation 33 to 11, with total capacity around 39,000 MVA. And we have more than 165 distribution transformer, some of them pole mounted, some of them indoor transformers, with total capacity in 55,000 MVA, and we have more than 4,300,000 consumers. And this peak planned generation versus the demand and achieved generation for the years from 2000 until 2018. From 2000 we start generation around 3,500 megawatt, and the average generation in 2018 more than 12,000 megawatt, and the peak generation we achieved in this year more than 19,000 megawatt. In our plan, we can reduce the gap between generation and demand, and we think that in 2022 there is a matching between the demand and the peak demand, which we estimate the peak demand 35,000 megawatt. Now this is just introduce about our capacity network. I will speak about renewable energy. On April 2019, MOE announced 7 investment projects after finalizing land acquisition with total installed capacity of 755 megawatts. And the closing date was on July 15, 2019. The proposal now under evaluation process by Ministerial Committee. The evaluation takes place according to an agreed criteria. This renewable plans details in Muthanna Governorate 3 sites, Sawa 1, Sawa 2, and Khadar, with total capacity around 130 megawatt, 30, 50, and 50 megawatt. And we have in Babel Governorate, Iskandariya, 225 megawatt, and Karbala around 300 megawatt, and Diwaniya 50 megawatt, and Wasat Jassan 50 megawatt, with total power plants total capacity 755 megawatt. The next step, announcing another investment project of total capacity of 500 megawatt after finalizing the lands acquisition. Also, the ministry have another plan, this plan that the initiative to motivate the consumer to change to be a prosumer. The action in this regard, the ministry announced investment opportunities for companies wishing to install and equip solar power generation system for citizens. This will be financed by soft loan and will follow up by unified technical specifications. Several companies have submitted their proposal and will examine in the study and qualification stage to be licensed by the ministry. The important step forward is that the ministry allocate 18 billion Iraqi dinars to supply small solar cell generation units, 3 kilowatt for each unit, through a tender announced in this regard. This will supply to poor people in order to enhance their capability to pay the consumption cost and encourage them to reduce the consumption through smart meter connections. The big impact for this initiative, the consumer will be able to repay the loans since MOE will purchase the energy generated from consumer and will deduct from the loan amount. Second, reduce the cost of energy production in current MOE, which can be directed towards providing additional energy to improve the electricity supply. Reduce the losses since the load flow will decrease. This will increase the available capacity of electrical network. By imposing the installation of smart meter for each consumer who wishes to connect it in this way, we will be indirectly contributed to the first step to the transition to smart network. This will make the consumer rely on efficient appliance and reduce the use of inefficient electrical appliance. Finally, MOE will no longer need to keep adding installed capacity to the electrical network and enhance reduction in CO2 emissions. The second topic is interconnection with regional countries. The interconnection of Iraq with Turkey, Jordan, Iran, Saudi, Gulf. Interconnection with Gulf countries. Negotiation complete with GCCIA on the agreement for the electrical connection. It is expected to transfer power by 500 megawatt. Final agreement will be signed with GCCIA this week. This interconnection with two transmission lines, each line 400 kV with double circuit and with capacity 2 by 1800 MVA between the north of Kuwait and south of Basra, from Al-Zor substation in Kuwait and Al-Faw substation in Al-Basra to supply separate area in Al-Basra. Interconnection with Saudi Arabia. It was agreed with the Saudi side through two memorandums of understanding to complete the feasibility study to interconnect the two countries. It is scheduled to complete the study on March 2020. Interconnection with Jordan. The technical requirements and the route of the lines have been determined. It is expected to purchase energy by 200 megawatt as peak supply, and the energy purchase formula and the final negotiation were recently agreed. Another interconnection with Turkey. The received proposals from Turkish companies to supply energy is now under review and study by a specialized committee. It is expected to purchase power about 300 to 400 megawatt. The last one, we had interconnection with Iran. This is only interconnection that transfer power to Iraq electrical grid through 3 transmission lines, 400 kV lines, and 1 lines, 132 kV lines. The transferred power is about 1,100 megawatt on average during summer season with take and pay principle. Interconnection goals: enhance the network stability and reliability, increasing the power transferred into the system without adding new power plants, accordingly less operational cost with more power transferred. Enhance the Iraq role in becoming a regional hub for transferring power from neighbor countries towards each other and also to Europe and North Africa. Reducing investment needed for establishment of new power plants, consequently reducing rotating and static reserve. Increasing the relying on the interconnection to compensate the sudden shortage in generation. Provide investment opportunity with telecommunication companies as it will provide fiber optical lines with the interconnection lines with high transmission capacities. This will provide high revenue for the Ministry of Electricity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we hand over to Martin.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today at this very important event for Iraq and its electricity sector. It's a bit difficult to be one of the speakers immediately after lunch. This is one of the most ungrateful spots where tummies are full and minds are drifting, but I promise that I will try to make it as short and sweet as possible. My name is Martin Sobek. I work for the International Finance Corporation. I'm part of the transaction advisory practice in the International Finance Corporation. Given the fact that solar has been identified as one of the priorities for renewable energy development in Iraq, I would like to take a few moments to present a very unique product called Scaling Solar that has been jointly developed by World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, and MIGA. It's a product that has been successfully implemented in several countries in Africa, and we're trying to roll it as in the Middle East as well. There are currently a couple of projects starting in some of the countries in the Middle East, in the Levant region, and also in Central Asia. Before we delve into the details of this product, why don't we take a look at a short video that will lead us into the presentation. Guess we have a little bit of a technical glitch. Apologies for that.
And control has enormous potential to quickly and affordably meet the growing energy needs of emerging markets. But building large-scale solar plants requires a lot of investment, and many developing countries have, until recently, been off the radar of top developers. To fix this, the World Bank Group has launched Scaling Solar, a one-stop-shop program that helps countries to attract investors, as well as run a competitive selection and contract the winning bidder to construct a solar power plant, all in less than 2 years. In Zambia, where an energy crisis has led to daily blackouts, Scaling Solar has made it possible for the government to quickly advance plans for utility-scale solar power plants near the capital city, Lusaka.
Now, going forward as a country, because we are in this drive to diversify, to expand the economy, and we're short of power. So it's very important that we people come on board and invest in renewable energy.
Scaling solar was conceived as a programmatic way of rolling out solar projects in power-starved countries where it is difficult for private sector to participate on its own. This is something that specifically has taken care of many of the concerns that these global clients of ours have in order to invest in emerging markets.
I think with scaling solar, what we've been able to do is to develop a coherent, transparent process that the private sector are able to work towards, as well as the public institutions on the government side.
For countries in a hurry to increase access to electricity, scaling solar is a powerful solution. For solar companies keen to expand their horizons, scaling solar is rapidly opening up new markets.
What scaling solar offers is a robust process, contracts which have been pre-negotiated, which are considered bankable, and transparency and speed. For us as investors, that's exactly what we're looking for. We saw that the IFC was running it, and Zambia is a country that we're looking to invest in.
Here in Zambia, we had about 48 bidders submit an expression of interest to be pre-qualified for this project, and we've shortlisted 11 of those to actually participate in the bid. This is a tremendous outcome.
Following Zambia's successful launch, scaling solar has expanded elsewhere in Africa, with tenders coming soon in Senegal and Madagascar, and several other countries in the queue. The emerging regional marketplace for solar power in Africa is also attracting increasing numbers of private companies and investors drawn to the new economies of scale that could soon be replicated in other parts of the world.
I think the Scaling Solar initiative is very good for the countries because it helps them to understand what the private investment needs. So the Scaling Solar initiative is really helping the country to start the market.
Programs such as the Scaling Solar program are quite key in terms of making sure that infrastructure can become a reality, and it'll help us light up the African continent, which is ultimately what we all desire.
Thank you very much. Good. So I guess it comes at no surprise to anybody that solar power offers a lot of potential and is a great solution for emerging markets. The prices of solar panels have dropped dramatically in the past couple of years. Many Iraq benefit from excellent irradiation levels. The construction rates for solar parks are considerably less than for other generation sources, whether it's renewables such as hydro or wind farms, or more traditional like gas or oil. Also, there is a need to diversify the electricity generation. And on either fossil fuels or oil or hydrological volatility. The case for solar in Iraq is absolutely obvious, right? There is a huge electricity demand. Irradiation levels in Iraq are very good. Solar projects can be introduced relatively quickly, much faster than most of the other generation sources. Solar also provides self-sufficiency and actually saves precious resources such as oil and gas. Also, solar is a very cost-effective and competitive source of power. If you look at the typical tariffs that you see for the newly installed hydropower, thermal, wind and solar plants, you will see that the feed-in tariffs and also the tariffs that have come out as a result of solar auctions are very, very competitive, very attractive. Some of the most recent tariffs have gone well, have declined well below $5 US cents per kilowatt hour. So what are the various options that are at the government's disposal when the government wants to launch an ambitious solar or renewable energy agenda? I mean, one of the options is to go via the traditional government procurement using public financing, right? But obviously, sooner or later, you know, the public debt limits will be reached, and also there is no benefit of knowledge transfer that is usually coming from the private sector. Another option is to get into direct negotiations with some of the developers. This is also one of the ways how things can be rolled out. However, there is a little bit of an element of imperfect price discovery, reduced competition, and then projects may be developed as a combination of private or public financing, sometimes purely private financing. Another step further that increases private sector participation is a competitive tender. One of the shop providing a combination of advice, financing, and credit enhancement, whereby competitive tender processes are organized and investors bid on the lowest tariff, right? And the last option that we have on the slide is the so-called feed-in tariff that requires a little bit of a price discovery, a development of the regulatory framework, and it's a tariff that is set by public sector to incentivize a larger number of developers to enter the market. However, it may not necessarily be the lowest achievable tariff in a given environment. So what is our proposal for Iraq? What we would like to aspire to is to help Iraq become energy independent. We would like to mobilize private sector to develop between 2 and 4 gigawatts of renewable energy within the next 3 years. We would like to put Iraq on map of international investors and introduce quality sponsors and international lenders in the renewable energy. We want to create transparent and bankable processes and support the newly elected government in its renewable energy agenda. What can we offer as IFC? Once the sites have been selected based on objective criteria such as proximity to the grid, adequate irradiation levels, IFC can support the government with project document development. We can structure and implement competitive procurement processes. We manage all technical, legal, environmental, and other consultants that are required to bring such projects to a successful completion. And we can obviously help the government market such a program to a global investors community. So what is it actually that we're talking about here? What's the solution? So Scaling Solar is actually a one-stop shop program for governments to rapidly mobilize privately funded grid-connected solar projects at competitive tariffs. The program brings together a suite of World Bank Group services under a single engagement based on a templated approach to create viable markets for solar power in each client country. It's a very long definition, so let me try to break it down for you into more palatable terms. What does it mean, a one-stop shop? We can provide everything in one product. Advice, financing that is attached to bidding documents, and also credit enhancement instrument with the help of our colleagues from the World Bank and or MIGA. The program has been designed with both government and developers in mind. We've looked at the priorities that governments usually have in developing such large-scale programs, and we've also taken the other side of the equation, right? We looked at what is it that the leading developers are looking for when entering a new market. How can we de-risk a project for them to make it more palatable and financeable for them? There is a focus on standardization. Scaling solar essentially means that there is a predefined set of standard documents. There's a government support agreement, there is a power purchase agreement, and some other agreements that are necessary to create, the contractual framework for a project like that. They are fairly standard, which gives a lot of comfort to investors, right? So many investors, when they look at a new country, at a new market, they will say like, but I don't know this place. I don't know what the regulatory framework looks like. I mean, I don't know what is the legislation like in that country. But when they see a standardized product, they feel comfortable. Okay, I've seen this elsewhere and it worked. And I know that it's bankable because investors have repeatedly managed to mobilize significant amounts of financing for projects using that contractual framework. De-risking to lower tariffs, obviously, projects are substantially developed to lower the risk for developers and government, which ultimately should result in the lowest possible tariffs offered by the competing investors. World Bank, debt, insurance, guarantee products, IFC financing, all of that comes into play to de-risk the project, lower investors' risk perception, and also to lower required returns. So what are the key benefits of scaling solar? For governments and utilities, for the public sector, it's speed. It's something that's ready, it's something that can be relatively quickly implemented. It's a customized process that has worked elsewhere, and there is no material reason why it shouldn't work, for example, in Iraq. There is certainty, it has worked elsewhere. We're not shooting in the air and trying to come up with something that hasn't been tested before, and it results in competitive fixed rate tariffs. What does it offer to the project developers and private sector? It opens up new markets for them. It reduces development time because they see a product that they're familiar with, they've seen it elsewhere, and they know that it works. It creates a level playing field, right? So when you launch a tender, you have a lot more competition under this approach, and investors believe that they're going to be treated fairly and equally. And this concept can be replicated on a regional scale. So once you start with a smaller project of, let's say, 100 megawatts or 200 megawatts, you can easily take the same set of documents, twist it a little bit here and there, and you can replicate it over and over again. For international donors and development partners, the product has also a considerable appeal. They can have a much more easier outreach to the local markets, offers a lot of leverage, transparency, and most importantly for us in the World Bank Group and other international financial institutions, it delivers impact. So what does it look like from the process point of view? First of all, in phase one, we prepare the project. We look at the sites, we conduct a quick technical and economic analysis of the sites. We do some site investigations to make sure that irradiation levels are appropriate, that there's proximity to the grid, and so on and so forth. We take a look at the legal and regulatory framework, and we twist the standardized scaling solar package to fit the needs of a particular country. Later on, we prepare the bidding documents, pre-qualification documents, power purchase agreement, government support agreement, and we launch the tender. There's a request for qualification. Bidder have a certain amount of time to conduct their due diligence and consult Then we review the proposals and prepare an evaluation report for the government. Financial close happens much faster under the scaling solar approach than under other scenarios because the documents are pre-negotiated, they're standardized, right? So the financing institutions are not looking at a completely new set of documents, but it's a standardized set of documents that they're familiar with. And when you start the tender process, there is a financing package, so to say, attached to the bidding documents. So the financial close can happen much faster than under normal circumstances. So once you have achieved financial close, then you're off to construction, which usually takes up to 10 months depending on the size and the complexity of a particular site. What is our role as IFC in this structure? In phase one, we help the government to identify the sites. We conduct all sorts of technical, legal, environmental, social, tax reviews that are necessary in order to come up with a tender package and bankable project agreements. In phase two, we agree with the government on the final transaction structure, incorporating the results of the due diligence into the project documents. We conduct a competitive tender process, select a winning bidder, and then we sign contractual agreements with the winning bidder, at which point the involvement of IFC transaction advisory part terminates. Then it is taken over by our financing colleagues who enter into discussions aimed at achieving financial close within the shortest possible time frame. So what do we need from governments in order to make it happen, in order to roll it out? We need them to formally adopt scaling solar. So they need to decide that, okay, we're going to try it, we're going to use this standardized set of documents, tweak it to fit the Iraqi environment, and we're going to make it happen. We need to make sure that the government gets all relevant stakeholders on board. So we need to make sure that the Ministry of Electricity is aligned with the Ministry of Finance and with all other stakeholders, utilities, and whoever else has a say in the development of such projects. We need to make sure that documents and key decisions the documents are approved quickly and key decisions are taken fast, because that's where most of the delays happen. The documents are fairly standardized, right? Any tweaks need to be formally approved, and that's exactly where delays happen. Obviously, we need support from the government in site identification, land acquisition processes, obtaining the necessary data in order to prepare tender documents for potential investors. Later on, the government needs to be present in the negotiations of the government support agreement, power purchase agreement. They need to issue a generation license to the IPP producer, and they need to enter into direct agreements with lender, and eventually request a PRG, partial risk guarantee, from the World Bank, and enter into all relevant documents underpinning the PRG structure. This is an example of some of the recent scaling solar mandates. Most of them are in Africa, but there are currently several projects under implementation in other parts of the world. In Central Asia, we're starting in the Middle East. And this is just an indication of what kind of players this concept has managed to attract. So you will see some leading names on this slide that have bought into this product and that are comfortable with this approach. And when they see something like that being developed in a new country, they're definitely interested to take a closer look. I will probably stop here. If you have any further questions or would like to learn more about scaling solar, you're more than welcome to visit the Scaling Solar website, and feel free to ask either myself or any of my colleagues. We're happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. We're now going to move on to Zainab Al-Qunawi. Thank you.
And gentlemen, I've come here today to act as a moderator, but due to last-minute change in the program, I've been asked to be a semi-speaker and answering questions. So please forgive me if I'm not prepared. I will say very few words about the topic of this afternoon. My name is Zainab Al-Qarnawi. I'm a commercial lawyer based in Iraq. I'm qualified in both England and Iraq. I have been involved on several occasions on advising on infrastructure projects in Iraq, so the topic of this afternoon's session is of direct interest to me. It has been said before, but is worth repeating. Iraq sits on some of the world's largest oil-proven reserves. But until today, we are still suffering from shortage in electricity in most parts of our towns and cities. There are insufficient oil refineries to meet Iraq's own domestic needs, and clean water supplies is another major problem. I'm from Basra, which is one of the very few cities in the world where it's often said that you go into the shower and you come out dirtier than you went in because of the dirt and the water. Everyone appreciates that things takes time, and the tasks facing the country are enormous. And it has been made worse by the war against Daesh over the last few years. As they say, Rome was not built overnight, so we have to be patient. But we all want to see a real progress being made by our government to address the issues that I have just mentioned, and that by introducing more mega projects in the country, particularly given that the population of this country is rising at a fast rate. They are expecting that there will be in Iraq as many as 60 million people living in this country by 2050. The other very important aspect, in my view as a lawyer, is helping existing mega projects to make a progress. This is vital. As a lawyer, I get involved when problems arise for one of the parties during the implementation of the project. So it may be my experience is limited to seeing problems rather than benefits. But I would say, and take advantage of being here, that one of the major problems that facing mega projects in this country is delays. Delays in communication, in responding to simple emails and letters, delays in agreeing and defining scope of works, delays in variations and extension as the project progress, and also, of course, delays in payments. These are just examples of the challenges are facing existing ongoing mega projects. So signing contracts with mega, which is excellent, very good news, but also we need to work on how to help this project to make a progress. I'm aware that in the big, thick contracts that one finds with mega projects, there are provisions which are in theory address some of these issues, but again, in my experience, they don't always work. The steps to be contractually taken themselves sometimes leads to further delays whilst being implemented, which is not good either for the Iraqi employer or for the overseas contractor. Is it therefore too big a question to ask how these decision-making processes can be speeded up for the benefit of the mega projects, whether existing ones or whether future ones? Therefore, today's topic, in my view, is extremely important to those living in Iraq and doing business. I'm very happy at the end of the notes of the final speakers to take any question and try to answer them as much as I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zainab. And we're now going to Robin Mills of Kama Energy.
Thanks for the introduction, Gareth, and thanks to you all for being here today. I'd like to talk about the Iraq's renewable energy sector and its impact on the electricity and gas sectors. And I'd like to start off with a picture of gas consumption in Iraq for the power sector. This is running up to 2025 in this view. And as we know, the power demand in Iraq is very much concentrated in the summer for air conditioning. And so we end up with these big peaks of gas demand every summer. The gas supply, of course, is coming primarily from, at the moment, from associated gas. It's being captured by the Basra Gas Company and other.
الذي يتم الحصول عليه من البصرة.
Increasingly in future, we'll have the orange that you can see on this chart, which is the non-associated gas, of which there's only one field currently in development or currently in production in the federal part of Iraq, but there are other fields that will be developed. And then on top of this, we have the imports of Iranian gas, which is shown in the light blue. Now, as we see going out to 2025, the amount of Iranian gas that will be required as gas capture increases, that could decrease. Nevertheless, we see Iranian gas or some kind of gas imports still being required to 2025 and beyond. In the winter time, there might at some point in the mid-2020s even be some surplus of gas at times, but there will still be a significant deficit of gas in the summer period. And this is, of course, even allowing for the fact that in summer, even by 2025, probably there still won't be enough generation capacity and transmission and distribution to meet all of demand. So if we allowed for even more generation to meet all demand, then we'd obviously need even more gas. And even this is allowing, of course, also for the fact that we also want to be replacing oil for power generation with gas as much as possible. So we'll need a lot more gas in the power sector. But what else can we do? And one solution that stands out very much, of course, is solar power. If we look at the demand pattern in Iraq, this is typical of the region. I've shown two parts of the year. Cold month, February or March, and the lower one is demand in July or August in the middle of the summer. Now, in the cooler months, the peak in the middle of the day is not so much. There's not really much need for air conditioning. However, of course, in the summer there's a huge peak. And solar power coincides very well with this. And if you installed a significant amount of solar power, you could come to the point that in a cool month, all of the demand could be met by solar power. And in a warmer month, a large part would also be met by solar power. And then the cheap associated gas can be used throughout the day to meet the baseload demand. Now, there's still a peak in the early evening when people go home and turn on the lights and turn on the television and so on, and it's still hot, they still need air conditioning, but the sun has gone down. And that has to be met by gas at the moment, but in the future we may have solutions like batteries for that too. So there's a very, very good fit of solar power, and this can help reduce the strain on the required gas supply. And Martin already showed us how good conditions are in Iraq for renewable energy, but just to reiterate, so I've shown three of the main options for renewable energy here. You have, on the top left, you've got the total solar radiation, which is important for solar photovoltaics. And in Iraq, that is very good. Not the best in the region, but still very good by global standards. On the top right, you've got the direct solar radiations. This is sun directly from the sun's rays, which is important for things like concentrated solar power, where we're using the sun's heat in mirrors to boil a fluid and drive a turbine. What is the great thing about concentrated solar power? Well, it can generate through the night by storing the heat in in molten salts. So it gets around the old problem of, well, how do you generate with solar power at night? And again, the conditions in Iraq for concentrated solar power are good. And out in the western desert of Iraq, they're very good. In the center of the country, still not the best, but not the best in the region, but still pretty good. And finally, the lower chart, we have wind power. This is perhaps less of an issue in Iraq, but there are also some areas in the country with reasonable wind speeds where wind power could play a role too. And the costs of these kinds of renewable energy have fallen dramatically in recent years, to the point that solar photovoltaics is now, in sunny conditions, the cheapest form of new power. So I've shown here the cost in cents per kilowatt hour for some of the main kinds of generation, and the cheapest right at the top is solar photovoltaics. And it's cheaper even than generating with gas, even at very low gas prices. And it is certainly cheaper than generating with oil. If you think about oil now at $60 per barrel or so, that is amongst the most expensive kinds of power generation possible. Wind power has also improved a lot. Wind power is also pretty cheap in a good location. And I've also shown on this chart solar rooftop. So when I talk about solar photovoltaics, I'm thinking of large farms like the ones that Martin was showing us out in open land. But of course, it's also possible to put solar on rooftops, on homes, businesses, factories, and so on. That is a bit more expensive, but it has the advantage that it doesn't need to use the transmission grid. It can connect straight to the demand. And as I said, costs have been falling significantly in recent years. And we've seen bids throughout the region. So many countries in the region have settled for a form of tendering for solar power. And over the past few years, we've seen costs halve since Dubai's first major solar tender in 2014. And then we've seen costs halve again. So the first project in Dubai was coming out at about 12 cents. And then their first large project was just under 6 cents. Then recently just under 3 cents. I think that this year we will see projects coming in under 2 cents. So even halving again. And it's not just Dubai, but other countries in the region, Jordan and Egypt, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, have all had very successful tenders for solar photovoltaics, as have some countries in Africa and Latin America that have good solar conditions. Now, I think as Iraq, there has to be a recognition that Iraq will not achieve these very, very low costs immediately. It takes time to develop a business model that investors are comfortable with, to develop a streamlined tender system. And there's still a significant perception of risk by developers of power projects in Iraq, that they demand a higher rate of return. But with some experience and developing some scale and running several tenders, then Iraq's costs can come down too. And we've seen this in Jordan, which of course is just next door, but Jordan's initial projects were fairly expensive, and Jordan is now achieving these costs, very low costs of 3 cents or so, which are similar to other countries in the region. So overall, we're very, very positive on the future for solar power in the region, and we're seeing it taking off in many countries now. So I've shown here our outlook for solar power installation in the Middle East region and over to including Egypt. And I think what we've seen, if we look at 2017 to 2018, we saw the total installed solar capacity in the Middle East region double. We've seen it double again from 2018 to 19. We'll see it double again to 2020, probably double again in 2021. I think that's quite a remarkable record of having 4 years of doubling. Now, the rate after that of increase will slow down, but by that point, solar is really starting to become a major factor in the Middle East energy scene. It's not just providing 1 or 2% of energy in the region, it will be providing 10, 20 and more percent. And eventually by 2035, in this view, we end up with about 160 gigawatts of solar power installed in the region, and that is kind of comparable to what China has today. And China is the largest single solar market and PV market in the world. So that would be quite a remarkable achievement over the next 15 years. And I've shown Iraq in the middle of this in the yellow, and I've outlined Iraq particularly to show that Iraq could be a significant part of that. Of course, Iraq is a little bit behind some of the other countries in the region, but the great thing about solar power is it's possible to catch up very quickly. It doesn't take 4 or 5 years to build solar as it does with a gas-fired power plant. It can take a year or 18 months to have a large solar plant in operation. Just looking at where the ministry has proposed various solar plants in Iraq, they're quite concentrated in the central part of the country. Now, as I mentioned, there are very good solar resources out in the Western Desert, and we've shown some other potential locations for plants out there, which would of course require some more transmission. But the advantage there is very good solar conditions, and also helping to serve some of the remote communities in more distant areas, and also up north in areas which were badly affected by Daesh and where it's taken time to restore the power supply. And so overall we see renewables as a fast and cost competitive way to meet growing demand. So if I show here the peak demand in Iraq, and this is assuming we were meeting all of demand, and then you can see peak generation in the yellow rising but struggling to keep up really. So with the current plan of gas-fired generation, yes, it increases, but still there remains a substantial supply-demand gap. However, if we add renewables, and particularly solar power on top, that can be built pretty quickly, and that can get around some of the transmission and distribution bottlenecks, then the capacity could increase a lot more, and by the late 2020s we could be at a stage of meeting all of Iraq's peak demand. Now, renewables offer opportunities, but they have significant challenges as well. There are some technical challenges. I think, to be honest, most of these have solutions. There are issues like people will always talk about dust and sandstorms and so on. I mean, for me, those are just issues of maintenance and cleaning. They've been tackled in other countries. There is, of course, a need to extend the grid and the transmission distribution grids where solar is installed. And there's a need to match to demand. Now, at the moment, adding a few percent of solar power doesn't really make any difference, but if we start getting a lot of solar generation, of course, there will be times that will start exceeding peak demand, at least in local areas, and then we need to have a way of matching that to demand, whether it's some kind of storage, batteries, or possibly exports to regional neighbours. But that's not the key problem. I think the economic barriers are more significant, and that's about getting the tariffs right, about cutting the subsidies on electricity, and of course about getting around the issue of distributed generation with diesel generators, and trying to either incorporate distributed generation in the system or make sure that grid power is available to everybody. Particularly solar power for small customers is a long process of finding those customers and microfinancing and so on to ensure that they can pay for the electricity. And we heard some schemes from the Deputy Minister about how that could be done. And then, of course, the side of, for the larger projects of financing, getting the right legal framework, the right financing framework in place for those, and running a few large-scale tenders successfully and establishing how the process will work. Now, if we look at how a couple of the success stories in the region went about their renewable plans, if we look at Jordan and Dubai, some of the things that they got right, well, they had a clear regulatory framework, they had renewable energy laws, they had clear renewable energy targets and a path to get there, and they had a stable regulatory framework which encouraged investors. For individual users, they had net metering schemes, and they had approved installers, so customers, homes, businesses could know who to go to get its solar power installed, and to know that they would be paid for electricity they put back in the grid. The grid infrastructure was developed and was reinforced where required, and there's some move towards smart grids to be able to balance the supply and demand more effectively. And particularly in Jordan, giving the solar developers the access to the low and medium voltage grids, so they could wheel power from one location to to their own business if they have an area of land somewhere distant from their business. So some hospitals, universities, for example, have done this and wheeled solar power through the grid to their premises. There can be various kinds of incentives. Dubai and Jordan have both used the tendering model very successfully, and that's kind of now widely accepted, but there have also been some direct negotiations on projects, and they're also open to proposals from companies which could then develop into tenders. And then, of course, the financing side, with some, particularly in Jordan, use of foreign aid to help finance public investment projects. Also tax exemptions in Jordan, and in Dubai, things like the Dubai Green Funds, so a large fund with a mix of government and private money specifically for green, including renewable energy projects. And a lot of attention on skills development, so not just technical skills, but also supply chain skills, commercial skills, legal skills to be able to run these projects effectively. And innovation, research and development, working with some major international companies on areas like improved solar panels that are most effective in high temperature and dusty conditions, on things like battery storage, on integrating with other technologies like renewable, like electric vehicles and so on. So that's looking a little bit further ahead, but it's about getting more value out of solar power and enabling it to make a major contribution over the long term, over the next 10 to 20 years. That's looking a little bit further ahead, but will become more important. And so, in conclusion, I think we know that the Iraq electricity sector has made some significant advances recently. It's still got a long way to go, and renewable energy, and in particular solar power, should be a major part of that solution. Iraq, I think, needs to start quickly, but start relatively small, and then try to build up, gain some experience from the key first projects, and then expand them. Take advantage of the great appetite there is to invest in this sector, and balance that effectively with development of the gas sector as well, so that together over the next few years Iraq can meet the target of using all of its gas effectively and meeting all of electricity demand. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. And finally, we have Hussein Zubaydi from Capital Investments.
Hello everyone, I'll be speaking about renewable energy in the Middle East, but throughout the presentation I'll be constantly referring to the Jordanian market, where this is where I actually gained most of my experience when it came to the renewable energy projects. So we'll start with why renewable. Specifically when it came to the case of Jordan, basically Jordan imports over 95% of their energy needs, and at the time, late 2000s and early 2010, where there was the geopolitical situation around the Middle East was unclear, and it caused instability when it came to fuel supplies. It made the government think actually of alternative solutions. So renewable energy was a viable solution at the time, and this is why the government actually went through and engaged the international community and local players to actually implement these projects. So for any policymaker, their policies revolve basically around 3 A's, so affordability, availability, and accessibility. So renewable energy at the time offers all 3 of them, where you can actually provide electricity in a cheap manner and in a timely manner also. So in parts of Jordan where there was a lack of access to the utilities and especially electricity, it was a viable option to actually implement these projects and actually go to market with them. This slide actually displays the renewable energy trends within the world and the Middle East. You can see that the Middle East mirrors actually the trends within the world, where actually the installed capacity in renewable energy projects have doubled just in 9 years. So you see that the Middle East had actually around 11 gigawatts of installed capacity in 2009, But by 2018, that number actually increased to just about 20 gigawatts. For historical trends, again, for solar, you can see that the growth was magnificent. It's just over 78 folds, but with wind, it's also above 6 times the installed capacity. But what this proves is that you have abundance of solar irradiation all throughout the Middle East. And these capacities, these installed capacities also display that governments are actually accepting that solar is actually should be part of the energy mix, and that they're actually going through initiatives to tender these programs, and Jordan was one of them. As for clean energy investments, this graph shows EMEA, so Europe, Middle East, and Africa, just over 9 years. The investments were marvelous. It's a huge amount of investments, just over $900 billion of worth of investments. That shows that both local domestic banks and the international community are actually international financial institutions going through these programs and implementing these projects. So the next challenges with the renewable energy sector, I think especially when it comes to solar, the big question, especially in Jordan, was what happens with when the sun comes down. Obviously, solar generates a majority of its power throughout the day, throughout the daylight. So what happens throughout the night? And this is where the government actually tried to tender a grid scale battery tenders, and but this has been on hold for a bit since the government would try to implement the green corridor solution for the grid. But I think the trends, especially now, you can see that battery prices are actually dropping. So we think in the near future, grid-scale battery energy storage systems will be viable, and electricity generated by solar power will be hopefully available around 24 hours a day. So what this is supposed to mean, this chart is supposed to show, is that petrol-based countries, especially countries such as Kuwait, Qatar, and UAE, each one of them has a target for renewable energy to be part of the energy mix. And I think this is where Iraq is in a very similar situation, where they can look at the other GCC countries, and especially petrol-based economies, and see that all these governments have basically initiatives and targets to reach to electricity generation by renewable sources. So I'll speak about the lessons learned through the projects that we have implemented in Jordan. Legal framework, I think enough of my colleagues on this panel have referred to actually giving the investors comfort, the developers comfort in terms of legality. And I think also when it comes to the market itself, for example, in Jordan, they've implemented net metering schemes, wheeling schemes, where they actually try to innovate the idea of how to deliver electricity in an effective manner towards different areas of the kingdom. And second point is commitment from the government. The government actually wanted to show that they're pretty serious when it comes to renewable energy, so they went with sovereign guarantees. And they've also implemented new laws that are actually geared towards being investment friendly, so where local banks, the international financial institutions, international developers, EPC players can come into the Jordanian market and implement these projects. And this is where it takes us to bankability, where things such as lenders direct agreement, interconnection agreement, giving the lenders the comfort of actually spending money within Jordan, because on average, most of these projects are actually financed through project finance schemes where about, on average, it's 75% debt and the rest is coming through equity. So as you can imagine, it's large amounts of money being spent, so they wanted some comfort on that. And last but not least, public awareness. Public awareness, the government went through different schemes where they actually educated the public about the benefits of renewable energy and how the public budget was actually being affected by importing oil and gas from neighboring countries. And even within the universities right now, they have renewable energy programs where we have graduates coming out of university that are working directly into renewable energy companies. So this is what comes to public awareness. And by 2025, the government actually aims to get about a quarter of its generation from renewable energy resources. Challenges. I think biggest challenge when it comes to renewable energy, especially when it comes to petrol-based economies, they don't view renewable energy as a complement, but as opposing to oil and gas, where I think they're interlinked to each other. I think both of them can actually benefit from each other within Iraq. Most of the loops that are used in transformers, inverters, turbines when it comes to wind energy are actually based from the oil and gas industry, and vice versa. You have operators operating off-grid solutions when it comes to oil extraction in the middle of the desert. So I think both of them can be interlinked, and it's not a black and white picture. I think renewables should be part of the generation capacity where the country can take advantage of the abundance of solar irradiation, especially in the Midwest and southern parts of the country. There is research when it comes to solar in Iraq that dates back to the 70s. So I think as a policymaker over here, if I was based in Iraq, I would take it into consideration and actually try to implement it in the soonest manner. Second challenge is efficiency and losses. I think renewable energy is still evolving, where you have solar PV amounting to about just 20% efficiency, but I think with technology and with economies of scale, these losses and efficiencies will actually come better with time. Grid management and who's going to pay for this. The government of Jordan, for example, delayed the process with the Round 3 renewable energy program just because of the intermittency that was happening with the grid when it comes to renewable energy, and they were waiting to add about 1 gigawatt of capacity to the national grid with a Green Corridor project. And I think this is something to think of, especially for Iraq, as the country is going through a reinvestment program with its national grid. And if they want to package it along with their tendering process for renewable projects. Last challenge would be infrastructure. Again, usually where electricity is being generated from solar or wind, it's a bit distant where the load center is actually taking place, where the consumption. So it's for the Ministry of Electricity and other public authorities to actually think about innovative ways to actually dedicate some lands near substations or near load centers where they can actually take advantage of go-to-market consumption. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Hussein and certainly to all of our speakers. We had a range of presentations then, starting with the Deputy Minister Nafi looking at the exciting plans for renewable energy, in particular solar, from the Ministry of Electricity, and noting in particular the gap between generated power and demand going forward. We had Martin presenting the very interesting, very impressive Scaling Solar initiative from the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation. Zainab focused on the bureaucracy of doing this, the red tape, how this can be speeded up through the procurement and government practices. We then had Robin, who presented some very interesting graphs here, looking at the need of Iraq to rely upon external gas imports after 2025, but then looking at the potential balance that could be hit if solar really takes off here by 2027. And then finally we had the same with the compelling rationale of solar, which we've heard throughout this panel, but also presenting the lessons that have been learned in Jordan and in the Gulf, in particular the UAE. So thank you to all of our presenters. I think you gave a fascinating set of insights into what is happening, what could happen, and the future of power generation in Iraq. I'm going to open it to the floor for questions for the next 15-20 minutes or so. Any questions at all? Yes, Bob. I hope it's a really good question now, Bob.
Thank you very much, Robert Tollest, Iraq Energy Institute. Very fascinating insights from all of you there. We've seen a few developments in recent years with distributed solar in oil fields, in emerging economies and remote areas where access to power for operations is less than ideal. We're now also seeing the emergence of microgrids, particularly in Africa, less so in the Middle East. So I just want to put to the panel, what sort of potential do you see for microgrid distributed solar in a country like Iraq, for example, where you could, in theory, you could have a hospital with backup generators, keeping power going 24/7. So question on distributed solar. Perhaps one for Robin.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I think the side for the oil industry and for like remote industrial sites and mines and so on, I think that's certainly a very interesting opportunity. We do see this already a lot in the oil industry, like globally, but there's certainly a lot of potential for that. Not even so much, and it can be in areas that are actually quite close to generation, but where it's simply saving on the cost of putting in a transmission or a distribution system. So there's certainly a lot more potential in the oil industry, and I think one positive thing there is the oil industry has the ability to finance these projects. So that makes that kind of thing easier to finance than let's say residential microgrids. I think for most of Iraq, most of Iraq is pretty close to the transmission distribution grid. It's just the grid is inadequate, although it's being improved. There may be some remoter communities that would benefit from that, and perhaps in the Kurdistan region as well, up in the mountains and so on. There are more remote areas as well which could use microgrids. But I think that's probably less of an issue here. But I certainly think the industrial and oil industry side could benefit a lot. And I think distributed solar as part of the grid should have a very big place, because there's a very good fit to demand patterns, and it's a great way to mobilize finance from businesses or even householders to install solar panels themselves, and gives them, particularly when there's still power cuts, gives them a little bit of protection against power cuts.
Any more questions from the audience? Okay, I think with that we have Yesa. Come coming in at the last minute.
Thank you, Professor Stansfeld, for the great moderation, and thank you for all the panelists. I'll make sure I do not take much time so we can all finish up and go early. At the back there, we were talking about renewables in Iraq, and we were talking about the difference between policy and regulation, and whether we have the proper policy to go forward with the development of renewables or not. The Iraqi government, the first 100 days, there was a report that came out of the Prime Minister's office, or the cabinet, where they had set a program for the next 4 years. So that might actually work. That might actually work as the beginning of a policy. But my question to the panelists, and maybe Mr. Nafi can help us with some insights, is what we really need in this country is a renewable energy law to put into it the basics of what we need to do, the regulations, what kind of projects we can have, what kind of agreements and contracts we can sign. Also to outline all the rights and responsibilities of independent power producers who would come to do solar in Iraq. Also to guarantee the bankability of a project, because that has always been a deterrent to many. Although Iraq's track record has been quite successful with a lot of successful IPPs, and we have seen some glimpses of that today with GE signing with Mass Group, for instance, on the expansion of Bismaya and other projects. So the question is, what kind of regulation does Iraq need to ensure bankability, to ensure rights, and to ensure that there is a market creation in the future? Thank you.
شكرا. راح أجاوبك بالعربي. قانون وزارة الكهرباء يتيح للوزارة بشراء الطاقة من أي جهة مستثمرة، ولذلك الطاقات المتجددة يعني مدونة استخدام الطاقة المتجددة جاهزة في وزارة الكهرباء. فيما يخص اكو نوعين، احنا يعني عندنا طريقتين لاستخدام الطاقات المتجددة. الخطة اللي وضعت مع مكتب رئيس وزراء من خلال انشاء محطات باور بلانت، Renewable Energy باور بلانت، واللي هذه المستهدفة 2550 ميجا وات خلال سنتين، وتشجيع المستهلكين على استخدام الطاقات المتجددة. هذه في دراساتنا انه يكون اكثر فائدة من ما تنشئ محطات طاقات متجددة، لانه انت من تخلي المستهلك يتحول من كونسيومر الى بروسيومر، راح تستفاد من اولا عدم وجود ضائعات، لانه يكون مصدر التوليد مباشرة مع مصدر الحمل. استغلال، تتوفر عندك طاقات في سعات في شبكات التوزيع وفي شبكات النقل. يعني انت من يكون التوليد بالقرب من الحمل ما يحتاج لك اضافة شبكات توزيع وشبكات نقل. طبعا تقليل الضائعات، لانه نقل الطاقة من خلال شبكات النقل وشبكات التوزيع يصاحبه التكنيكال لوسز وبعض الأحيان نون تكنيكال لوسز، بالإضافة إلى التوجه باستخدام الخلايا الشمسية اللي هو سولار بانل. جزء من الفوائد مالته أنه تخلي المستهلك
way to preserve their energy and power according to certain standards, and many other technical aspects in both ways, and to encourage the consumers to the first project is that we will announce about 3 kilowatt will be given to the poor families, and it will promote the usage of the renewable energy, and it will be useful in reducing the usage of electrical power, and usually the housing units in Iraq are normal houses and not apartment buildings, so they don't have they do have roofs, so it will reduce the heat that reaches the houses. Thank you so much. شكرا جزيلا مرة أخرى. هل هناك أسئلة أخيرة من
all that is left is for me to thank once again our excellent panelists for 5 very impressive, informative, compelling presentations, and again to thank the organisers for putting together a fantastic day of events. I think we're a little bit, I've just rounded up, but maybe if you can catch up with them afterwards, that would be fine. Thank you. Thank you again.